All right. So with that, let's start with gender and leadership. Okay, guys. No. That's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. Okay. So women in leadership actually wasn't really studied until the 70s, right? Because this wasn't really considered to be something that was really basic in organizational behavior. Why? Because most women were homemakers, right? It was expected for them to stay home and take care of the family and the household. But as I mentioned, in the 70s, the increasing number of women in leadership positions and women in academia brought about this dynamic change of studying the disproportion of between women and men in the workplace. Okay, so when we talk about organizational boundaries, it's important to realize that they can predict a large degree of the disparity, right? And there's different things that are controlled by organizations that can really dictate the difference between men and women. And these are things like culture, policies, and practices. What we're going to be talking about in this lecture is, like, for instance, the idea of gender biasness. I'm sure everybody knows what that is, but what is it? It's the tendency to prefer one gender over another. Okay. Let me say that again. Gender biasness is the tendency to perform one gender over another. That could be a potential Kahoot question. Anybody need me to repeat that one more time? Okay. So when we talk about gender biasness, a lot of the times it can be unconscious, right? A lot of it is what society has predicted and ingrained. It's been ingrained throughout society. But when we talk, like, for instance, about unconscious biasness, this is when one individual may unconsciously attribute certain attitudes and stereotypes to a person, right? Because stereotypes, unfortunately, we're human beings and we live by stereotypes, whether we realize it or not. But the whole purpose of educating yourself and really self-examining yourself is to see those stereotypes, because stereotypes are learned, right? They're learned through our culture. They're learned through our interactions with others. A lot of the times we may have the stereotypes may be embraced by our family members or by the school or background or etc., right? Age gaps, generations. There's a lot of differences. So for instance, like my mother is, she's 30 years older than me. So for her, when I told her that I was gay, it was something that she had a really hard time dealing with, right? Because this was not something that was really out in her time, right? So now she's better about it as the years have gone by. But initially, the way we kind of continued our relationship was she just didn't want to talk about it. That was an area of myself that she didn't want to know, right? So this is an example to show how we can hold stereotypes and ingrain them in our identity and what we think about people. Why are stereotypes so negative? Why are they such a bad thing? Because really what they do is they pigeonhole people, right? And they lead us to misjudgments about people. So as I mentioned, when we talk about women in the workplace, it's important to realize that a lot of times you may have a culture that's not embracive of women. You may have policies that are not as supportive as they may need to be, or practices, right? There is something called social norms. All organizations have this, right? Social norms, they're like shared standards of acceptable behavior in groups, right? So as I mentioned, culture varies, right? So you may have a very supportive culture, or you may have a culture that's very embracive of women, versus you may have a competitive culture or a culture that's primarily dominated by men. So therefore may not be as supportive as you may think towards women. Make sense? So there's 3 categories that serve to promote organizational boundaries. And I wouldn't know these guys because this is a question on your exam. One is the masculine corporate culture, right? Here, this workplace culture, it includes ideas like male social norms. Maybe that there's inflexible anytime, anywhere work model. Women are considered to be tokens, right? They're the token woman. There's lack of female corporate role models. Maybe there's a tolerance of sexual harassment. In other words, maybe sexual harassment occurs, but they just kind of look the other way. So for instance, I'm sure I've mentioned it to you guys before, but when I was younger, I used to work at a restaurant, and there was actually a lot of sexual harassment that happened there, because of the fact that, the cooking area was primarily dominated by men, and the women were all waitresses, right? There were no male waiters. So it was very common for you to go in the back and to have, one of the cooks whistle at you. Or one time it even got as far as one of the cooks had been drinking and they smacked some girl on her butt, and it became a very big deal, right? But the idea here is that although they would do this like right in front of the owner, but he just kind of turned a blind eye. Although he never, engaged in sexual harassment himself, by him not doing anything, this is showing a tolerance and therefore almost like allowing it, right? Second, there's a gender biased talent and succession in management programs, right? So organizations, they hire women at lower levels and they promote them less, or sometimes they promote them at slower rates than men. They may pay them lower wages. Although the gap between men and women when it comes to wage is beginning to minimize. I mean, it's improving every year. It's important to realize that there's still a disparity there. And this is the reason why we need to have this discussion, right? That it's important that we talk about things like this because progression cannot continue if it does not remain relevant, right? And lastly, there's a lack of top management commitment. So a lot of the times you may have organizations that may say, hey, I am for hiring women, I'm for embracing, for promoting Me Too movement, et cetera, right? But a lot of it has to do with the actions and the type of policies that you implement with your organization, right? So for instance, there was a study that found that only 1/4 of large companies had executive committees with more than 20% of women, despite over half of them having implemented more than 25 gender diversity action programs, right? So the idea here is that they're talking about, being inclusive, but they're not executing this inclusiveness, right? Any questions, or are we okay? All right. So I don't expect you guys to know these statistics. I'm not gonna like question you on them. I may ask you, I may include like 1 or 2 of them as a potential extra credit question on the exam, but I'm not gonna grade you towards them, so you don't have to memorize them, because I do realize that often it's really difficult to memorize things like this. The reason why I mention all of these things is because I want you guys to have a clearer picture of what I'm talking about, right? So since the start of the pandemic, women, they've lost 5.4 million jobs net wise, right? Versus men have only lost 4.4 million. So if I would ask you why you think that women have lost this job, I'm sure most people would say probably because schools shut down, right? Because women have to take care of their children, et cetera, right? But other things that are important to realize is that a lot of organizations, especially because this is intended to be, this is like a worldwide issue here, right? So the idea here is that a lot of workshops that are not run by women, but that primarily had women in them, a lot of them were shut down, right? Because, like, for instance, our supply chains completely went kaput, right? Because of the fact that everything just stopped, right? So therefore, there was no need to make pants. There was no need to make shirts, et cetera, right? So the idea here is that there's a big disparity here. Although women, the reason why I mentioned this one is because, me and my wife, we had to talk about this one, right? And she mentioned that, that it's really unfair that women have to quit their job to take care of children, right? Because, I mean, there's two things that are unfair here, right? Why should it have to be a woman that does this? But then secondly, why should it automatically be assumed that women are the primary caregivers of their children, right? Because a lot of the times it takes away from a male, right? Men can be excellent caregivers, right? My brother, he is a full-time dad, and he's absolutely wonderful, right? So that's just something to mention. Only 27.1% of women are managers and leaders. Please keep in mind that these are statistics from 2019. I did not include 2020 because of the pandemic. And I do realize, it's been a little odd because of, the pandemic. So, and there's a lot of external circumstances. So therefore, I felt like 2019 was the most effective time to talk about all this. But only 21% of women are managers and leaders. 61% of women, they think that motherhood disrupts their progressive opportunities. That one really sticks with me because think about that, 61% of women. So that 61% of women are already thinking that motherhood, if they truly want to pursue a career, especially a luxurious one, right, that they cannot be mothers. So I can only imagine how this was like 30 years ago or 40 years ago, right? I'm sure the number must have been extremely high. If you think about it, like, for instance, somebody like Marilyn Monroe or Audrey Hepburn or what have you, big time A-lister actresses, if you had a child, you had to quit the industry, right? A lot of women who were very well-known actors, they would quit the industry because they had to, because they decided that they wanted to be mothers. It's very unfortunate that they would have to choose like that. In addition, 42% of women claim that they've been discriminated against at work. 48% of women occupy entry-level roles. And work-life balance conflicts, they astonishingly, they're at 72% for women, okay? Because once again, women have to do a dual role, right? They have to be both caregiver and professional. In 2020, women made an average of 81 cents for every dollar that a man makes. So that's an average, okay? So do realize that they do differ amongst organizations, right? But on the median, that's what it is. In 2021, women make 82 cents for every dollar that a man makes. Flight attendants only make 92%. The one that I found that was really interesting was that among healthcare practitioners, women family doctors only make 94 cents to the dollar, while nurses make 98 cents to a dollar. Versus although women comprise 90% of the nursing profession, men still make more than women do. So, I mean, that's amazing, or at least in my opinion. So some other interesting facts to be aware of, right? When we talk about education, women, they earn 57% of bachelor degrees, 60% of master degrees, more than half of doctoral degrees. But we're seeing that there's still little change, right? Women only represent 4% of Fortune 500 CEOs. When we come to talk about the political front, they only occupy 127 seats of the 535 seats in the US Congress. So it's like 23.7%. And women of color, they only occupy 48% or 48 of those seats. So, I mean, the number is even lower, right? So this is a timeline. Like I said, I don't expect you guys to know this. Why did I include this timeline? So here you see, these are all findings. These are all innovations created by women, okay? Like for instance, look at the circular saw. It was created by a woman. Yet we often associate saws to be, it's often associated from society to be a man thing, right? It's a man quality. Men mess with saws, not women, right? My father is somebody like that. I wanted to, do, woodworking when I was in high school, and my dad would not hear of it, right? Because no, that's a male quality, not a woman quality. So this is just an example to show, right, that Although the reason why I like to mention this is because I want you guys to take a look at this, because these are a lot of these inventions I didn't even know were created by women, right? I knew some of them, but a lot of them I did not know. And after I started really looking at them and seeing what women had to endure to be able to create these, the ambition and the drive that they had to have, it's very sad that I didn't know this, right? Because this is not something that's ordinarily talked about in school. And this is a conversation that should happen, right? These are things that should be relevant. I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that, people don't say, oh, who created the flat bottom paper bag? But I mean, think about how useful that bag is and how we still use it today, right? I mean, this is just an example to show. Margaret Knight, she almost got that invention stolen from her by a man. And his argument was, she actually created it, and then she was talking about it, and he overheard about it, so he decided that he was going to, take her findings and make it his own. And his argument was that she was a woman. How could a woman create something like that? And by the skin of her nails, she was able to receive the necessary recognition. Versus, let me see, like the airplane muffler. Eldorado Jones, she actually was she actually only promoted women. So she had a shop where she only hired women. People often associated her and thought she was a lesbian, so therefore she was outcasted and ostracized. And although it was only years later that she was given the recognition for that, but it was taken over by a male. So this is just examples to show, right? I like to mention this because I want people to realize that these are things that we should encourage and show women, right? Because as of last year, only 10% of US patent holders were women. Although women account for half of the doctoral degrees in science and engineering, only 10% of women are actually creating things out there. And it's very unfortunate. So this just continues on. Kira Knightley, she actually created a water conservation polymer. It's going through the Simpsons right now, but it's going to change the world. It's intended to, I think she was only like 16 when she made it. So, it's intended to be able to hold more water, so that way droughts, their droughts can be improved, so that we can help crops. You can help with global warming. This is something that can be extremely useful, right? So it's actually, hold on, sorry, this stupid box is in my way. So it's actually, as I mentioned, that in 2020, women make an average of 81 cents for every dollar, right? So there was an actual study where they found that over a 40-year career, that a woman actually stood up to lose about $900,000 over a lifetime. Okay. So when you really put it into that kind of number, it's really, it makes you think, right? Because you think it's just a couple of cents, but think about how many, those cents add up, right? So like I mentioned, you guys don't have to know this, but this is intended for you guys to take a look at it and really think about it, right? I mean, like the most basic things, I mean, everybody knows that Barbie was created by a woman, but, I did not know that, our security systems were created by a woman, or that, I don't know. I mean, there's just so many to count. Sorry, I'm trying to change it over. Okay, so there is something called the glass ceiling metaphor, right? When we talked about, as I mentioned before, gender biasness, there's certain gender biases that we need to consider, right? So for instance, there's like performance support biases. And that's when employees and managers or colleagues, they provide more resources and opportunities to one gender and then to another, right? Then there's also something called performance review biasness. And that's when employers and managers, they review an employee of one gender different from another, right? They've actually done studies of this, and they found that individualistically, people will value both men and women if they're the ones that are judging. they will value a man more than a woman. So that means a woman can't even value another woman because that's what society has ingrained in them, right? So when we talk about the glass ceiling metaphor, this was actually the intention of this is that it implies that women and men have equal access to level and entry positions. But then as you're climbing the ladder, all of a sudden there's this glass ceiling that a woman will hit, right? And that means that her levels of opportunities are now becoming harder and harder. It's a barrier, so that way she can't reach the top, right? This was actually something that was extremely popular, right? It was, I want to say that it was created in 1986. They called it the glass ceiling metaphor, but now they've actually altered it to what is called the labyrinth, because the idea that both men and women have equal access to entry and mid-level positions is not so, right? It's very idealistic, but it's not true. Versus a woman in the labyrinth, the idea here is that a woman has to continuously go through like a maze, right? There's different turns and corners, and every woman's venture is different. So in other words, if you're a woman of color, you may have, more aspects to that maze than if you're a woman, a Caucasian woman, right? If you're, a woman of color who is, I don't know, who, is LGBTQ, that's another difference, right? Or, backgrounds, etc. So the idea here is that it's not as clear and cut as the glass ceiling metaphor wants to portray, right? Because the idea here is that, like a labyrinth, it's very hard to maneuver where the road of success is, right? So once again, I wouldn't know what the glass ceiling metaphor is. It's helpful for your Kahoot and for your upcoming test, okay? And please keep in mind, as I mentioned today, the glass ceiling metaphor is something that's not really embraced. Now the alternative image that researchers like to relay the strive of women is to the leadership labyrinth, which is, as I mentioned, conveying the challenges that a woman needs to endure in order to reach success. So when we talk about understanding the labyrinth, we find that gender gap is something that's a global phenomenon. So it's everywhere, right? There's an underrepresentation of women. And as I mentioned, please keep in mind that this is something that is increasing, right? We are progressing. Women are finding their voice, and they're finding, more acceptance. But it's important that we continue to talk about this, right? Because only by talking about this can we keep it relevant. We want to always strive to refine until there is complete equality, right? So there are 3 types of explanations for this labyrinth, and we're going to talk about each one, but there's the differences between men and women investments in human capital, gender differences between men and women, and prejudice and discrimination against females, okay? So when we talk about human capital differences, women have less human capital investments. They have less human capital investment in aspects such as education, training, and work experience. So what is human capital? This is like the skills and knowledge and experience by an individual in terms of their value to the organization, okay? So really it's the worth of that employee. Often organizations will consider women to have less human capital, right? A lot of the times the idea here is that lack of human capital for women means that there's a pipeline problem. Often they'll say that women are not educated enough. Women, it's not our fault that we can't give them positions, they're just not qualified. Well, the idea here is that women are educating themselves, right? They are seeking the training, they are seeking the work experience. So no, there is not an issue in the pipeline. The idea here is that women are following the necessary protocols, but somewhere in between the pipeline, there's a leak, and that's where women fall out of the pipeline, okay? When we talk about experience and employment continuity, we find that women have been found to have less work experience and employment continuity than men. Why is this? Because Um, a lot of the times women are forced to quit their job if they have families, right? Because a lot of the times the organization will only be so supportive. So for example, I have a friend right now that she was working from home. Actually, her whole organization was working from home during the pandemic. I mean, of course, it's still going on, but at the beginning of the pandemic. So with the intention of trying to create some type of normalcy, they made everybody come back. Okay. So she has 3 kids, and the youngest one is 2, and the oldest one is 6. Okay. But because she's been in that organization, they have like you have to be there a number of years before you can actually become, it's not permanent, I'm trying to think of the word it is, but that it's almost like permanency, right? Oh, it's called exempt, for her to become exempt. Okay, so she's not there yet. She's been there for 2 years. I think she's like 6 months shy or something like that of becoming exempt. So therefore, they will not give her a work alternate schedule, right? Because they told her that because her kids had to go back to school, right? And she can't afford a babysitter. And to be very honest with you, she's very hesitant about hiring a babysitter because before you had to worry about finding a trustworthy babysitter, right? Who would take care of your kids responsibly. But now you have to worry about where that babysitter has been and what they had subjected themselves to, right? Because they could be very well carrying the virus, and these children are not vaccinated because they cannot be, right? So therefore, she chose to put them back in school and, trying to encourage the 6-year-old to wear a mask, right? And I think she put the other 2 in like a daycare or something like that, right? So anyways, I'm sorry, back to the story. They made her use her vacation time because the youngest one, I mean, because the oldest one gets out, or the younger ones get out early, right? So she has to leave work like an hour early or something like that. So they've made her use the time because they don't want to give her an alternative schedule because she's not exempt. So therefore, her time is coming up. I think she has like 3 days left or something like that. So she went and talked to her superior. She talked to leadership and she said, I need something to happen here because if not, how am I going to keep my job? And they said, well, we won't fire you, but we'll just dock your pay. Right. And then they told her that they wouldn't fire her they give her a certain amount of time. And then after that, she's going to have to quit or they're going to have to reevaluate her place within this organization. So really think about how unfair that is, right? I mean, I myself think it's unfair. I may be biased because she is my friend, but I mean, think about it doesn't matter regardless. You do not want turnover in your organization, especially if you have good employees and committed employees, right? There should be some type of bend for women or men in that situation, right? Because there very well are men that are sole providers, and maybe they're the only caregiver, and they need to be considered as well, right? We find that that women being less experienced or not being able to continue their employment is largely driven by the disproportionate responsibility that women have to assume, right? As I mentioned, it's a double-edged sword. They have to be parents, they have to be caregivers, they have to support the household while financially supporting the households, right? Because unfortunately, it's very rare to find one person at home if you have, a couple having somebody at home while having the other one at work. Normally, both spouses have to work in order to maintain because everything's just so expensive, right? It's found that those who take time off their careers, they often find it difficult to re-enter. A lot of the times when people take time from their career, they consider them not to be as committed, right? They consider them not to be truly driven because they have other commitments, right? Which is their family. And those who take advantage of workplace leave and flexibility are often marginalized as, the the baby moms taking advantage, right? Any questions so far, guys? Are we okay? Oops. Okay. All right, when we talk about gender differences in leadership, this is this chart right here. It's just showing women in the global workforce. This is from Europe. It's just showing, intended to give an accurate description, right? Statistically, it's been found that women often lead in more democratic and participative manners than men. So in other words, women are considered to be more communal. They're more likely to be better collaborators, right? Versus men are considered to be more driven and individualistic. The argument is that women's underrepresentation in elite leadership positions is a result of differences in leadership styles. So in other words, that men are just simply more effective than women, and that's the reason why they're leaders. That's not necessarily so. As I told you, the best type of leadership is leaders who understand that leadership is shared, right? So if women are more communal, if they're more likely to collaborate, wouldn't that make them good leaders, right? Women are often found to be devalued because they may occupy typically masculine leadership, right? They can, it can often be that the evaluators are men. Sometimes when as I've talked about, they've done numerous statistics, numerous studies about this, that often this gender biasness, we're not even conscious that we have it, right? They did a study where they actually gave papers. It was a paper, like a paper that needed to be evaluated. It was just like a basic academic paper, right? And what they found was they gave it to a group of men and women, and they did two separate groups, right? So they were both a collaboration of men and women, equal numbers, right? So two primary groups like this. The first group, there was no name given on the actual academic paper. So when they read it, they evaluated it solely on the content that was given, right? The work that was shown. Versus when they put a name on it, they found that women were often more acclaimed than women when it came to evaluating those papers, right? So it's just an example to show how this unconscious biasness can creep up without us even realizing that, right? Yeah. So when we talk about other aspects such as like negotiating and self-promoting, research must be interpreted in light of social cost and backlash of women, right? It's actually found that men are more likely to negotiate more for themselves. Although women will ask for a raise, they will not fight for a raise, right? Versus a man will. But they did find that women will fight for a group. So let's say that because they're so communal, because they're so collaborative, they're more likely to fight. So like, let's say that you're part of a group and you're fighting for a certain right, they're more likely to fight more ambitiously for the group than they are solely for themselves, right? Women, they face significant gender biasness and social distinctiveness when self-promoting. A lot of the times, if a woman is functioning well in a male-dominated role, they're considered to be real ball breakers, right? Or they're considered to be very cold, or they're very mean. There's no way that they're married. They're etc. Right? I'm sure everyone has heard these stereotypes, right? Versus if women excel in, let's say, for instance, in education, it's considered to be a good thing because this is what women do, right? But it's important that we are conscious of these things because often we fall into these stereotypes, right? We take these stereotypes at face hand. And a lot of the times, these stereotypes are not only implemented through society, through TV, through social media, etc. A lot of it can come from your own home, right? It's something that's inherited down to you. So, for instance, the idea that I was scared to come out to my parents, I knew that my mother and my father wouldn't be supportive of it. So therefore, I almost had this personal shame that I had to overcome before telling them, because it was something that was handed down to me, right? That being gay is wrong, versus this is something that I do not want for my child, right? I won't, because there will be a time, and hopefully I hope to be able to be alive for this time. There's going to be a time when children will feel free enough to say, hey, this is what I am, this is my enjoyment, just like they can say, I don't like chocolate, I like vanilla, right? Whatever it may be. But the idea here is that we're not there yet. So when we talk about prejudice and discrimination against female leaders, it's also important to realize that stereotypes are equally hurtful to men as well, right? We often put these stereotypes on men, these pressures on men that are not needed. So as I mentioned, gender stereotypes, they're very well documented and they're highly resistant to change because we create an attitude with these stereotypes, right? And attitudes are really what implicate behavior. So it's very hard to change it. You as students, I highly, highly, highly encourage you guys, before you come up with any type of preconceived idea, make sure you do your research about it, right? Whatever it is, whether you are taking up politics or whether you're, deciding to commit to one religion or whatever it may be, make sure that you do your necessary research, so that way you can make a decision based solely on your findings and not anyone else's, right? Because I'm sure everyone knows that whole areas are skewed, right? For instance, the news, we want to think that it's completely valid, but it's not. A lot of the times it's skewed depending on who they're trying to relate and what audience they're trying to reach, right? So it's important that, you as academics, you as open-minded individuals, take those considerations into hand, right? But stereotypes, they do two main things. They describe the beliefs and about attributes of men and women, and they prescribe how men and women should be. So for instance, when I was younger, commercials were always, when, like, let's say it was a Barbie, it was always girls playing, right? Today it still is, except the other day I saw one for a Barbie and there was a boy there. So I thought that was very cool, right? Versus with boys, you see boys playing with Hot Wheels, not girls. So it was always, it was always this thing that I didn't tell my mom, hey, I want a Hot Wheel, but in my head, I thought that Hot Wheels were for boys, right? I never thought as a child that I could one day become president, because of the fact that all presidents that I'd known, because there was literally a big chart of the presidents, right? All the presidents that we've had throughout our years as a country, they're all men. So I just, it wasn't that I wanted to be president, but it was just something that never even came up, because of the fact that nobody had preceded that boundary, right? But now it's a new conversation for younger children. Women, girls may now have the motivation to one day become president. And I think that's absolutely awesome, right? So as I mentioned, these stereotypes we often fall into. For instance, men, they're often considered, they're often expected to be confident, to be assertive, to be independent, to be the primary breadwinners, right? Which is not fair. It's not fair to them because it's a lot of pressure that you put on people. They're considered, they have to be agentic, meaning that they have to be strong individuals, right? How many times have we heard the saying, men don't cry? It's important to realize that that's not true. It's not fair to put that on children. It's not there to put that on anyone, right? Because when we put people in a box like that, then we don't give them the opportunity to grow and to grow into whatever full potential they want to be. Versus when we talk about women, some common stereotypes is that they're supposed to be warm, they're supposed to be helpful, they're supposed to be nurturing, they're supposed to have concern for others, they're supposed to be communal. And that's not true. I'm sure everyone knows a woman who's very sensitive, and they know a woman who's not so sensitive, right? So these are just examples of showing, just like, for instance, I have some brothers who are a little more assertive than other brothers, right? I think I've mentioned you have problems. So, there's quite a bit there. But the whole idea here is that we vary, right? We vary because of our perspectives, because of our experiences, our background, our education, etc. A lot of these stereotypes are dictated by the culture that we are in. So for instance, if you are in I don't know, let's say that you're in a very competitive environment. So you work on Wall Street. Maybe you crying at the office may not be considered to be the wise thing to do, right? For a woman or a man, because that's a competitive environment. And therefore, often we relate, strength with, we relate showing emotion with weakness. So this is just an example to show that they vary amongst cultures, right? So in other words, these stereotypes can be carried out through your work culture, through social media culture, through your family culture, through your friends, through, I don't know, maybe you play football or maybe you play basketball, whatever it may be, right? But there are cultures that exist in those groups. So how can we rethink women in leadership? One, you can leverage the power of choosing. Women need to be intentional about their careers. The power to choose is often overlooked, right? So in other words, women often don't even consider what's not there. So think, for instance, how I mentioned that I never thought that I could be a president or a vice president, because that was something that did not occur to me because it was a choice that I was never even mentioned to be able to have, right? You want to address women's leadership challenges and their need for competency. Ensure that female leaders have the experience and resources to learn what they need most. So in other words, consider giving guidance for on-the-job learning. They actually did do studies on this, and they found that 60% of male managers are uncomfortable mentoring or working one-on-one with women. Why is that? Then anybody tell me why? Somebody?
Why males are more hesitant to work with women, you say?
Yes, like one-on-one with women.
I think because traditional, I'm so sorry for the background noise too, but I think it's traditionally women are, seen as weak, not weak, well, yes, weak and like fragile, and also not, I'm totally bashing on my own self, but not like the smartest, like what would they know,
Yeah, or they're afraid of rumors too, right?
Yes.
Think of like a married man. They may be a little hesitant to work one-on-one with a woman because then there may be rumors that somebody is having an affair with somebody, right?
Yeah, and they say like women, they tend to work on they're leaded by emotion rather than logic.
Exactly. And you know what? I've actually heard that quite often from women themselves. So for instance, I actually knew this lady that told me women would not make good presidents. There should not be a vice president because what will they do when they're on their period? They're so emotional. I'm emotional when I'm my period. And I just looked at her in dismay, like I didn't know what to say because, but because this is something that she has incorporated and she's learned from society, right?
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So other things to do: rethink systems, challenge assumptions. You want to schedule opportunities for networking, mentoring, and maybe helping to create new social norms. Encourage women to make the right networks. Encourage them to network, right? A lot of the times, think about it. I like to mention it like this. Often feel the difference between men and women is that almost think of it like a relay race, right? And men have been running and women have been sitting down and they're watching men run the laps. And then all of a sudden they're said, okay, go. So there's a disparity there. Though women are running, they're still behind. So therefore they're almost new to the race. So someone who's been there longer should be more embracive of that, right? They should be able to say, hey, let me help you. How can I assist you? How can I encourage you? How can I promote this, right? Because it's not just men who need to promote women. Women need to promote themselves as well. Yeah. Any questions, guys? All right, then we are done with this one.